The first time Sergeant Jake Hawk Morrison saw a Tiger tank, he thought he was looking at a fortress that had learned to move. It was November 1944, somewhere in the frostbitten hell of eastern France, and Morrison's M4 Sherman, affectionately called Lucky Strike by her crew, had just crested a small rise near the village of Bourgogne. The morning mist hung low over the fields like a burial shroud. Then the world exploded. The Tiger I opened fire from 1,200 yards out a distance at which the German beast was practically invincible. Morrison watched in horror as the Sherman, 2 positions ahead of his, simply disintegrated. The 88mm shell punched through the front armor like it was tissue paper, and the tank erupted in a geyser of flame that sent the turret spinning 15 feet into the air. "Reverse! Reverse now!" Morrison screamed into the intercom. But his driver, Tommy Chen, was already throwing the Sherman into reverse before the words left his mouth. They'd all seen what just happened. They all knew the cold mathematics of armored warfare on the Western Front. The Tiger I was a nightmare made of 56 tons of Krupp steel. Its frontal armor measured 100 millimeters thick, double that of the Sherman. Worse still, it was sloped at angles that made it effectively even thicker. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from over a mile away, while the Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's paint at any distance head-on. American tank crews had a grim joke that traveled through the ranks like a disease. It takes 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger. The first 4 created distraction by dying. Morrison had seen it happen too many times to count. Good men, good crews, burning alive in steel coffins because the bean counters back in Detroit had prioritized production numbers over survivability. The Sherman was reliable, easy to maintain, and they could build them by the thousands. But against German heavy armor, they were death traps. "We're sitting ducks out here, Sarge," called out Bobby Kid Hernandez, their loader. At 19, he was the youngest of the crew, and Morrison could hear the panic rising in his voice. Kid had every right to be terrified. They all did. "Stay frosty, Kid," Morrison said, forcing his voice to remain steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Chen, get us behind that farmhouse, now." The Sherman lurched backward, tracks churning mud and frost. Another 88mm shell screamed past, so close that Morrison felt the displacement of air against his face where it protruded from the turret hatch. The shell impacted the ground 20 yards to their right, sending a fountain of earth skyward. They made it behind the stone farmhouse, just as a third shell punched through the wall where they'd been seconds before. Stone dust and mortar exploded across their vision. "Jesus Christ," whispered Red O'Brien, their assistant driver and bow gunner. "Jesus Christ. We're gonna die out here." "Shut it, Red," Morrison snapped. But he was thinking the same thing. They all were. The Tiger was hunting them now. Morrison could hear the deep rumble of its Maybach engine, a sound that every Allied tanker learned to dread, growing louder as it repositioned for a killing shot. The German commander knew exactly what he was doing. He'd pin them behind the farmhouse, then maneuver for a flank shot. It was textbook Panzer tactics. Morrison's mind raced. Every instinct told him to run to get Lucky Strike, the hell out of there, while they still had a chance. But 3 other American tanks were scattered across this field, and 2 of them were already burning. If Morrison ran, the men in that 3rd Sherman, the one commanded by Lieutenant Davis, would die for certain. "Sarge?" Chen's voice crackled through the intercom. "What do we do?" It was then that Morrison remembered something. A crazy story he'd heard 2 weeks ago in a bombed-out bar in Nancy, told by a drunk tank commander who'd supposedly survived an encounter with a Tiger near Aricourt. The man had been half mad with shell shock, rambling about impossible angles and the devil's geometry. Everyone had dismissed him as crazy. Morrison had dismissed him as crazy, but desperate men do desperate things. "Kid," Morrison said slowly, an insane plan forming in his mind. "How many rounds of AP do we have left?" 12, Sarge. "But you know they won't." "I know what they won't do at normal range and normal angles," Morrison interrupted. "But what if we could change the geometry?" Through his periscope, Morrison could see the Tiger beginning its flanking maneuver, moving with the terrible grace of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. Its commander was taking his time, confident in his armor's superiority. That confidence, Morrison realized, might be the only weakness he could exploit. "Chen, on my mark, I need you to do something that's going to sound completely insane." What happened in the next 3 minutes would change Morrison's life forever. It would save his crew, destroy what should have been an indestructible tank, and birth a legend that would ripple through the ranks of American armor divisions for the rest of the war. But first, Jake Morrison had to convince his crew to commit what amounted to tactical suicide. "Listen up," he said, his voice cutting through the fear that filled the tank's cramped interior. "I've got a plan. It's crazy. It's probably going to get us killed, but it's the only shot we've got." "You want us to what?" Chen's voice cracked over the intercom, a mix of disbelief and terror. Morrison couldn't blame him. What he was proposing went against every single page of the tank commander's manual, every hour of training at Fort Knox, and every instinct of self-preservation. "You heard me," Morrison said, his eyes never leaving his periscope. The Tiger was moving into position, its massive gun traversing. They had maybe 60 seconds before it had a clean shot. "We're going to go hull down on that slope, tilt the tank at a 45-degree angle, and take the shot while we're practically standing on our side." "That's suicide," Red O'Brien shouted. The suspension will hold for the 3 seconds we need." Morrison cut him off. That drunk commander in Nancy, the one everyone thought was crazy, he wasn't rambling. He was trying to tell us something that saved his life. Morrison had spent the last 2 weeks replaying that conversation in his mind, and only now, facing certain death, did the pieces fall into place. The man had talked about angles, about how the Tiger's armor, while thick, had weak points that only appeared at extreme angles of attack. Not the angles you'd get from normal combat positions, but geometric impossibilities that required the attacking tank to essentially tip over. "Here's what that man figured out," Morrison continued, speaking fast. "The Tiger's side armor is only 80 millimeters thick, and it's vertical, no slope to it. But you can't get a clean shot at the side unless you flank it, and this bastard knows better than to let us do that. However," he paused, letting it sink in, "if we position ourselves on that slope to our left, if we drive up it at just the right angle, the tank will tilt. At 45 degrees, our gun will be pointing under the Tiger's main armor belt, right where the hull meets the tracks. That's the weak point. The Germans never armored it properly because they never thought anyone would be crazy enough to shoot from that angle." There was silence in the tank. Then Kidd spoke up, his voice trembling but determined. "The shell would have to travel." "Jesus, Sarge, you're talking about a ricochet shot. The round would skip off the ground and come up under the belly armor?" "Not exactly a ricochet," Morrison said. "More like threading a needle while falling off a cliff. The round has to travel at a depression angle we're not supposed to be able to achieve." "But if we tilt the whole damn tank?" "The geometry works," Chen said slowly. And Morrison could hear the gears turning in the driver's mind. Chen had been an engineering student before the war. Oh my God, the geometry actually works. "But Sarge, we'd be completely exposed. One shot from that Tiger while we're on that slope and we're done." "We're done anyway if we stay here," Morrison replied. "That Tiger is going to come around this farmhouse in about 30 seconds and pump an 88 straight through our side armor. At least this way we take a shot at him first." Another 88 millimeters shell impacted somewhere close, shaking the ground beneath their treads. "Lieutenant Davis is still out there," Morrison added quietly. "Third platoon. If we run, that Tiger picks them off one by one. We're the only ones in position to try this." The intercom crackled with static. Morrison could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. 4 men, trapped in a steel box, being asked to essentially throw themselves sideways off a hill while trying to thread a ballistic needle through a gap most people didn't even believe existed. "Screw it," Chen finally said. "I didn't come all the way to France to die hiding behind a farmhouse. Tell me what you need, Sarge." "That's my driver," Morrison said, feeling a surge of pride despite the terror. "Kid, Load AP. Red, you're going to call out the angle as we climb. I need to know the exact moment we hit 45 degrees. How the hell am I supposed to? There's a level gauge above your station. Use it. That thing's for checking if we're stuck in mud, not for use it. Morrison could see the Tiger now, emerging from behind a shattered tree line about 400 yards away. Its commander had spotted them too. The massive turret began to traverse, the 88mm gun turning toward Lucky Strike with terrible mechanical precision. We're out of time, Morrison said. Chen, that slope is 30 yards to our left. I need you to hit it at exactly 15 miles per hour fast enough to climb, slow enough to control. When I say now, you crank the left tread to maximum and the right to 50%. That'll tilt us. And if we flip completely over, then we die upside down instead of right side up. Move. Now. The Sherman's engine roared. Chen threw the tank into gear, and they lurched out from behind the farmhouse, immediately drawing the Tiger's attention. Morrison saw the flash from the Tiger's gun, felt time slow to a crawl as the shell screamed toward them. It missed barely the German gunners, surprised by their sudden movement. The round passed so close that it tore the radio antenna clean off the turret. Slope. Hit the slope, Morrison screamed. Chen aimed Lucky Strike at the small hillside to their left, a natural rise in the terrain that formed maybe a 30-degree incline. Under normal circumstances, you'd never try to climb it at an angle. The tank would slide, lose traction, possibly throw a track. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Sherman hit the slope and immediately began to tilt. Morrison felt gravity shift, felt himself pressed against the side of the turret as the entire tank canted over at an impossible angle. 20 degrees, Red called out. 30, 35. Morrison's world was sideways now. Through his periscope, he could see the Tiger tracking them, its commander clearly confused by what the crazy Americans were doing. 40 degrees. Kid, round in the tube. Loaded. 43. 44. This was it. Morrison gripped his gun controls, making minute adjustments. The Tiger filled his sight picture, but from this insane angle, he could see underneath it, could see the gap between the thick hull armor and the tracks, could see the vulnerable underbelly that the Germans never thought anyone would be able to target. 45 degrees. Firing. The 75mm gun roared, and in that instant, Morrison knew, win or lose, live or die. They'd just attempted something that no tank crew in the entire war had deliberately tried before. The shell left the barrel at a downward angle that should have been impossible, traveling on a trajectory that defied every rule of tank versus tank combat. And then, time froze. Morrison watched through his gun sight as the armor-piercing round traced a path that seemed to violate the laws of physics. The shell traveled down and forward, hitting the frozen ground about 20 yards in front of the Tiger at exactly the angle Morrison had desperately calculated in his head. The round didn't ricochet, it skipped, like a stone across water. The shell bounced once off the hard earth, its trajectory now carrying it upward at a shallow angle, directly toward the small gap between the Tiger's hull and its tracks. The German commander had never seen this coming. How could he? No tank doctrine in the world accounted for an enemy tank tilting itself sideways on a hill to create a shot angle that shouldn't exist. The 75mm shell disappeared into the gap. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Tiger I exploded from the inside. The shell had penetrated the thin belly armor and detonated among the ammunition stored in the hull. Secondary explosions rippled through the tank like firecrackers, blowing the hatches open and sending flames shooting 30 feet into the air. The turret actually lifted an inch off its ring before crashing back down. "Holy Mother of God!" Kid screamed. "We got him. We actually got him." But Morrison wasn't celebrating yet. "Chen, get us off this slope before we—" Lucky Strike's left track lost purchase. The Sherman, already tilted at a 45-degree angle, began to slide sideways down the hill. Morrison felt his stomach lurch as gravity took over. The tank was going to roll. They'd killed the Tiger, but now they were going to die anyway, crushed inside their own tank as it flipped over. Counter steer. Hard right, Morrison shouted. Chen was already doing it, fighting the controls with every ounce of strength. The right track dug into the hillside, churning up frozen earth. The Sherman shuddered. Tilted further, Morrison could see the ground through his periscope now. Could see the earth rushing up to meet them. And then, the right track caught on something solid. A buried rock, maybe. Or a tree root. Whatever it was. It gave Chen just enough traction to wrench the tank back from the edge of disaster. Lucky Strike slammed back down onto all its treads with a tooth-rattling crash. Morrison bit his tongue hard enough to draw blood. Red O'Brien let out a string of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. But they were alive, and the Tiger was dead. "Status report," Morrison barked, forcing himself back into commander mode despite the adrenaline making his hands shake. "Drive train operational," Chen reported. "Right track took some damage, but she'll hold." "Gun's fine," Kid added. "I've got 10 rounds left if we need them." Morrison risked popping his head out of the turret hatch. The Tiger was burning furiously, thick black smoke pouring from every opening. There was no way anyone inside had survived. Through the smoke and chaos, he could see Lieutenant Davis's Sherman emerging from cover, apparently intact. They'd done it. Against all odds, against every rule of armored warfare, they'd killed a Tiger tank in a head-to-head engagement. But Morrison's moment of triumph was cut short by what he saw in the distance. 2 more Tigers were emerging from the tree line, about 800 yards out. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Red muttered. Morrison's mind raced. They'd gotten lucky once. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. But lightning didn't strike twice. The element of surprise was gone. Those Tiger commanders would have seen what happened to their comrade, would be on guard against any tricks. "Except, Chen," Morrison said slowly, "how's that right track? Can we do it again?" There was a pause. Then Chen's voice came back, tinged with a manic sort of laughter. "Sarge, are you out of your damn mind? Probably. But there's another slope about 200 yards north. Steeper than this one. If we can get there before those Tigers get in range, they'll blow us apart the second we move," Red protested. "Not if we use the smoke from this Tiger as cover," Morrison countered. "Kid, load another AP round. Chen, the second I give the word, you make for that northern slope like the devil himself is chasing us." "Because he is." "Lieutenant Davis," Morrison called over the radio. "You seeing what I'm seeing?" 2 Tigers, north tree line. "Hawk, what the hell did you just do to that first one?" "Geometry. LT. Pure geometry. Listen, I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, you flank wide east and hit them from the side. Standard tactics. Can you do that?" "Hawk, you're crazy. But, yeah, we can do that. 3rd Platoon is with you." Morrison dropped back into the turret. His crew was looking at him. He could feel their eyes, even though he couldn't see their faces in the cramped, smoke-filled interior. "We're really doing this again?" Kid asked quietly. "We're really doing this again," Morrison confirmed. "Because there's a dozen American tanks behind us, and if we don't stop these Tigers, they're all dead men. We've got something the Germans don't have. We've got a trick they've never seen before and don't know how to counter. We use it." What Morrison didn't say was that the odds of pulling off the same maneuver twice against alert enemies were astronomically low. What he didn't say was that those Tigers were probably already radioing for support, that in a few minutes this field might be crawling with German armor. What he didn't say was that he was terrified. "All right," Chen said. "Let's go kill some Tigers." The Sherman lurched forward, bursting from the smoke of the burning Tiger. Immediately, both German tanks opened fire. An 88mm shell passed so close overhead that Morrison felt the heat of its passage. "Smoke! Deploy smoke!" Morrison ordered. The Sherman smoke generators kicked in, pumping out thick white clouds that mingled with the black smoke from the burning Tiger. Visibility dropped to near zero. "Chen, you'd better know where that slope is, because I sure as hell can't see it." Trust me, Sarge. They burst out of the smoke cloud doing nearly 20 miles per hour. Both Tigers had lost them in the confusion and were traversing their turrets, searching for a target. Morrison saw the slope dead ahead steeper than the last one, maybe 40 degrees of incline. This was going to be even more dangerous than the first time.
Kid, soon as we tilt, you reload fast as you've ever done. We're taking 2 shots.
2 shots? Hitting the slope. Brace. Lucky Strike climbed the hillside at an angle, and once again, the world turned sideways. This time it was worse. The slope was steeper, the tilt more extreme. Morrison felt like he was going to fall out of the turret.
50 degrees,
Red called out. 55. Sarge, we're too steep. But Morrison was already acquiring his first target. The closest Tiger had spotted them now was turning to face them. Its commander must have thought the Americans had lost control, that they were going to flip over. He never expected what came next. Firing. The gun roared. The shell skipped off the frozen ground, came up under the Tiger's hull, and penetrated. The German tank shuddered but didn't explode, not immediately. Reload! Reload! Kid was already moving, muscle memory taking over. He slammed another round into the breach with superhuman speed. 2 up. The second Tiger was firing now. Its shot hit the hillside just below them, showering Lucky Strike with frozen earth and rocks. Morrison traversed to the second target, made his calculations in a fraction of a second, and fired again. Another skip shot. Another impossible hit. This time the detonation was immediate and catastrophic. The second Tiger's ammunition must have cooked off all at once, because the entire tank lifted off the ground and came apart like a toy. Pieces of armor rained down across the field. The first Tiger, mortally wounded but not yet dead, tried to return fire. Its shot went wild, the crew probably already bailing out. Get us down. Now, Morrison ordered. Chen reversed, and Lucky Strike slid backward down the slope in a barely controlled descent. They hit the bottom hard, bounced, and came to a stop. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The intercom was filled with nothing but heavy breathing. Then, Lieutenant Davis's voice crackled over the radio. Hawk, did you just kill 3 Tigers? Morrison looked out at the field. 3 massive German tanks, burning, all killed by a single M4 Sherman. That, on paper, shouldn't have stood a chance against even one of them. Yeah, LT, Morrison said, his voice hoarse. Yeah, I guess we did. The story should have ended there, in that frozen field in eastern France, with Lucky Strike's crew celebrating their impossible victory. But in war, nothing stays secret for long. By that evening, every tank commander in the 3rd Armored Division had heard about the impossible angle shot. By the next morning, the story had reached General Patton's headquarters. By the end of the week, tank gunnery instructors were attempting to codify what Morrison had done into something that could be taught. They called it the Morrison Maneuver at first, though Morrison himself hated that name. Later, it would be known by various terms: the skip shot, the geometry kill, or simply the devil's needle because of how precisely you had to thread the angle to make it work. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The maneuver was incredibly dangerous and only worked under very specific conditions. You needed the right terrain, a slope steep enough to achieve the proper angle but stable enough not to flip your tank. You needed frozen or hard ground that would allow the shell to skip rather than penetrate or fragment. You needed an enemy tank positioned just right, at the perfect range, with its vulnerable underbelly exposed to the trajectory. Most importantly, you needed a crew crazy enough or desperate enough to try it. In the remaining months of the war, there were 17 documented attempts at the Morrison Maneuver by various American tank crews. Of those 17 attempts, 6 resulted in successful kills of German heavy armor. 4 resulted in the attacking Sherman flipping over or throwing a track, with varying levels of crew casualties. 7 attempts simply missed. Morrison himself never attempted the maneuver again. After that day in November 1944, Lucky Strike was rotated back to a support role.
The brass had decided that Morrison and his crew were too valuable to risk in frontline combat, not because of their fighting prowess, but because they were the only crew who could reliably teach the maneuver to others. Morrison spent the rest of the war as an instructor, teaching other tank commanders the principles behind his impossible shot. He tried to stress how dangerous it was, how it should only be used as an absolute last resort. But young tank crews, desperate for any edge against German armor, sometimes heard what they wanted to hear. Staff Sergeant William "Billy" Hodges, commanding an M4A3 named Avenger, attempted the maneuver near the Rhine in March 1945. He successfully killed a Panther tank, but his Sherman flipped during the descent, crushing Hodges and his driver. The rest of the crew survived. Technical Sergeant James Park, a Korean-American tanker from California, used a variation of the skip shot to disable a Jagdpanzer IV near Cologne. Park's innovation was to use a less extreme angle, only 30 degrees instead of 45, which was safer but required closer range. He survived the war, and later wrote a technical manual on unconventional tank gunnery. But perhaps the most shocking fact about the Morrison maneuver is what happened after the war, when Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German tank commanders. Hauptmann Friedrich Schulze, who had commanded Tiger tanks on the Western Front, was asked about the skip shot during his debriefing in June 1945. His response, recorded in the interrogation transcript, was chilling. "We heard rumors about this technique by January 1945. At first, we did not believe it was real. We thought it was Allied propaganda, meant to damage morale. But then we saw photographs of destroyed Tigers with entry wounds beneath the hull, wounds that could only have come from below. We realized the Americans had found a weakness we never considered. It haunted us. Every time we faced Shermans, we had to consider that they might attempt this suicide attack. It made us hesitate, made us second-guess our tactics. In armor warfare, hesitation is death." Think about that. The Morrison maneuver didn't just kill a handful of German tanks. It created psychological uncertainty in an enemy that had grown comfortable with their technical superiority. German tank commanders, who had spent years confident in their armor's invincibility, suddenly had to worry about an attack vector they'd never trained for. The maneuver's ultimate impact wasn't measured in the number of tanks destroyed. It was measured in the hesitation it created, in the second-guessing, in the knowledge that American tank crews were willing to do absolutely insane things to level the playing field. After the war, Jake Morrison returned to his home in Pennsylvania. He married his high school sweetheart, ran a hardware store, and raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about his time in the war. When asked about the maneuver that made him famous, he would usually deflect or change the subject. But in 1988, when Morrison was 63 years old, a journalist from Army History magazine tracked him down for an interview. Near the end of their conversation, the journalist asked him what he felt when he realized his impossible shot had worked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You have to understand, we weren't trying to become heroes. We weren't trying to revolutionize tank warfare. We were just 5 scared kids in a metal box, trying not to die. The Tiger was better than us, in every measurable way. It was faster, heavier, better armed, better armored. On paper, there was no way we should have won. But we had one advantage the Germans never counted on. We were willing to break every rule in the book if it meant our crew got to go home. That day, that's all it was. That's all it ever was." 3 of Lucky Strike's 5 crew members survived the war. Tommy Chen died in a traffic accident in San Francisco in 1952. Red O'Brien lived until 2001, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 76. Kid Hernandez became a high school teacher in Texas and passed away in 2003. Jake Morrison himself died in 1994 at the age of 69 from complications related to lung disease, probably from breathing too much tank fumes and cordite smoke during the war. The M4 Sherman, for all its flaws, ended the war with a better kill ratio than most people realize. Yes, it took losses, terrible, heartbreaking losses. But American tank crews found ways to adapt, to innovate, to survive against technically superior opponents.
The Morrison Maneuver was just one example of battlefield ingenuity, born from necessity. Today, if you visit the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Moore, you can see a small exhibit dedicated to the Morrison Maneuver. There's a diagram showing the angle of attack, a photo of Morrison and his crew standing in front of Lucky Strike, and a placard that reads, "In November 1944, Sergeant Jake Morrison and his crew demonstrated that in warfare, innovation can overcome technological disparity. By utilizing unconventional tactics and accepting extraordinary risk, they achieved what experts deemed impossible. This is the essence of the American fighting spirit. Not the weapons we wield, but the ingenuity and courage of those who wield them." Next to the placard is something else. A piece of armor plate, about 6 inches square, cut from the underside of a Tiger I tank recovered from that field in eastern France. The metal is penetrated by a neat hole, surrounded by scorch marks. It's the entry wound from a 75mm armor-piercing shell that had no business penetrating a Tiger tank. The wound from an impossible shot that became possible because 5 terrified men refused to accept that they were supposed to die that day. That's the real story of the Morrison Maneuver. Not a tale of effortless heroism, but a reminder that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory is measured not in armor, thickness, or gun caliber, but in the desperate creativity of people who refuse to give up. Jake Morrison never claimed to have changed tank warfare. He never claimed to be special. But on one frozen November day in 1944, he and his crew did something that military experts said couldn't be done. And in doing so, they gave hope to every other outmatched, outgunned crew fighting for survival in the steel coffins they called home. That legacy, the legacy of making the impossible possible, is worth more than all the medals and commendations in the world.